Hi, this is Johnny. I'm going to be going over Task 4, the Elementary Mathematics Assessment task from the edTPA Elementary Education Performance Assessment. So let's get started. At the bottom of this page, the handbook sets out what you need to be thinking about in general. So let's look at this. The Mathematics Assessment Task 4 requires you to analyze evidence of student learning of mathematics from one assessment completed by a whole class of students. The assessment must come from a learning segment of 3 to 5 lessons taught by you or the classroom teacher. Then, based on your analysis from the assessment, you must plan and teach a re-engagement lesson that addresses your students' learning needs. So this is all of it in a nutshell. And a simple note down here, whether you do the literacy tasks first or second, or the math task first or second, all the tasks should be submitted at the same time for scoring. So let's keep that in mind. Now, as with the other tasks, there are 4 sections. The first 2 are what do I need to think about and what do I need to do. If we look up here, in Mathematics Assessment Task 4, you will analyze student work samples to identify a targeted learning objective and plan and teach a re-engagement lesson focused on students' needs. Students' needs are going to come up throughout this task, so keep that in mind. This task and the evidence you provide are framed by your understandings of your students and their learning. As you develop and document your evidence for this task, you need to think about the following. So let's take a look at this bulleted list here. So, you will need to think about how you will analyze whole class evidence to identify patterns of learning. Patterns of learning is a term, a phrase, a way of thinking about the analysis that you will need to hold on to, and I'll talk about that more in depth in a moment. How will you use student work to analyze mathematical errors, confusions, and partial understandings? How will you re-engage students in learning to address identified areas of challenge or need? So areas of challenge or need, struggles, those things will come up throughout the task. And then, how do you use evidence of student learning to reflect on the effectiveness of your re-engagement lesson? All right, and that will come up in more detail later as well. Let's think about what I need to do. First off, you will need to select a class. And this class, if you teach more than one class, select one focus class for this task. All right? And this class needs to have a minimum of 4 students in this group. So if you're teaching a group of students, there have to be at least 4 students in that group to consider it a class. Now, something particular to the mathematics task is that you need to have a mathematics context for learning. Now, you did such a thing or are doing such a thing for the literacy portion, but you need to do the similar work for the math task. A lot of the things will be similar in terms of students' needs and such, but there will be particular questions about the mathematics program, and that helps the evaluator for this assessment know what kind of school you're in, who your kids are, what kinds of things do they bring to their learning, and the shape of the math program, what kinds of texts or materials are most frequently used in your program. And this context for learning should be no more than 4 pages. All right? Next, you will need to identify a learning segment. And so, as they suggest, work with your cooperating teacher to find a sequence of lessons, a 3 to 5 consecutive lessons segment that will include a student formative assessment that you can analyze. Now, I'm going to talk more about this in a moment, but before we get started, you want to think about these 3 to 5 consecutive lessons, this learning segment, as being rich in mathematics in a number of different ways. It shouldn't be just focused on procedures. It shouldn't just be some kind of activity that doesn't reach for kids' deeper understandings of mathematics. It should also be a sequence of lessons that allows students to show their work in depth and in multiple ways. All of those things will help you later on when you are doing your analysis of their assessment. So that's going to be something critical to this task is choosing the right set of lessons that set you up to consider conceptual understanding, to consider procedural fluency, and to consider problem solving and mathematical reasoning. And lastly, on this page, you want to identify a central focus along with the content, standards, and objectives. So you need to have both of those things. What is at the heart of this sequence of lessons? What are the big ideas coming out of this lesson segment, this learning segment of 3 to 5 lessons? And then what content, standards, and objectives sit alongside that and make sense? And again, the 3 things we're going to care about throughout this task: conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and mathematical reasoning and problem-solving skills. All right? So it says the central focus should support students to develop conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, mathematical reasoning, and problem-solving skills. All right? So these 3 are the most important part, the biggest consideration throughout this task. So a couple things to hold on to before we move on. All right. These are the things you'll be doing in this task. You'll be giving a formative assessment. You'll be analyzing students' work on this assessment. Based on that, you're going to design a re-engagement lesson. You will teach the re-engagement lesson. And then after you've taught the re-engagement lesson, you're going to reflect on the effectiveness of that lesson. So these are the things that you'll be doing for this task 4. Next, again, most important. This is most important. The learning segment should give students opportunities to develop conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, mathematical reasoning, and problem solving. And I'm going to be saying those things often throughout this task just because they are that important. Last thing you need to consider is you need to briefly describe the instruction preceding the formative assessment. So because you don't have your lesson plan setting up what's to happen in the learning segment, you have to describe the kinds of things that have been happening in your classroom around the mathematics that set up the formative assessment and give some context for what students were doing before the assessment. All right? Now this next section is going to be probably the thickest section of the task. So let's go through this step by step. The next thing that you'll be working on is analyzing the student's work. Now, first you're going to have to develop or adapt a formative assessment. It should be an assessment that is completed by the whole class, and the formative assessment should reflect the work of individuals. All right? And around these 3 things: conceptual understanding, computational and procedural fluency, mathematical reasoning, and problem-solving skills. Now, the important thing here is it says develop or adapt a formative assessment. Instead of just using a formative assessment that might come out of the given text or the given program in your classroom, you might start with that given assessment and then rewrite it and remake it so that it better sets students up to show these 3 things. All right? So these 3 things are always at the top of your consideration. All right? So make sure that your assessment sets you up to be able to see how students are doing or their understandings regarding these 3. Always these 3. Now, practical matter, make sure you have a blank copy of the assessment to submit. Now, more important than that is you need to define the evaluation criteria. And the evaluation criteria, however you set them out, they should hit, again, these 3. All right? So consider your evaluation criteria as looking for some kinds of conceptual understanding, looking for some evidence of procedural fluency, and your criteria looking at the means and methods students go about their problem solving. So the evaluation criteria you set out in your for your formative assessment should always go back to these three. Now, the big part here is you're going to be collecting and analyzing the student's work. And you want to summarize the student's learning from your analysis on some kind of graphic chart or table. You might choose to do it in narrative form. Graphics, charts, and tables tend to offer you some opportunities to look for patterns of learning that aren't necessarily as available in the narrative form, and I'll share some of that in a moment. Okay, so here's some details about how you might go about this. You may submit text files with scanned student work, or oral assessments for primary grade students. A video or audio file will work. All right. For each focus student, a video or audio work sample must be no more than 5 minutes in total running time. All right. So let's go over a couple things here. First off, what are patterns of learning? What's nice here is edTPA describes patterns of learning in terms of mathematics here. So let's look at this. Patterns of learning includes both quantitative and qualitative patterns or consistencies for different groups of students or individuals. Quantitative patterns indicate in a numerical way the information understood from the assessment. For example, 10 out of 15 students or 20% of the students. So when you're writing this up in your commentary, you might want to use this kind of phrasing. 3 of the 15 students, or 8 of the 15 students, or 19 of the 20 students. And that's a good way to describe things quantitatively in terms of patterns of learning. 3 of the 15 students were able to add unlike fractions without procedural error. Okay? Patterns like that. Qualitative patterns include descriptions of understandings, misunderstandings, or developmental approximations that could explain the quantitative patterns. So, for example, given that most students were able to, it seems that they understand. So keep these in mind when you're writing about patterns of learning. When you get to the commentary, using the term patterns of learning is probably a good idea. I noticed, or I see within my analysis, these patterns of learning, or this pattern of learning was evident for 3 of my 15 students. So keep this in mind. Now I want to go into more depth about the chart. All right. So first off, since there's such an emphasis on concepts, computation, and problem solving, you should organize yourself around that. So here's an example of criteria that have been set out around those topics. Now if we take a look at this chart, you can see that this particular rubric talks about or sets out procedural fluency, computational understanding, and problem-solving strategic reasoning. This also includes communication and representation. So you're not limited to these 3, but you must include these 3 some way. And in this particular rubric, you can see that the descriptors set out what levels of understanding might be evident. So if we take procedural fluency, emerging, or the lowest level, attempts to use appropriate procedures, may use inappropriate procedures. The next level up, developing, uses procedures correctly but makes computational errors or other slight errors. Proficient, so this will be grade level. Okay, so 3 is what we're hoping for at least. Student shows work step by step with correct computation. And then exemplary, what might be above and beyond. Student uses correct procedures that result in good solutions and checks work. So something that goes beyond the base expectation. All right. Now, in this particular form, you can see numbers here. This might be the way you set out how many students met each one of these descriptors. So 4 of the 20 students were emerging, 6 of the 20 students were developing, 10 of the 20 students proficient, and none of the students were exemplary in this regard. Now what's useful about this organization is that you can start looking for patterns of learning. So if we look along here, we can see which areas had the greatest struggle. So if we went down here and it was communication representation, you can see that students struggled more. But if we go up here, we can see also that in problem-solving strategic reasoning, we had 11 students of the 20 not meeting proficiency. So 11 students. And these 3 students, the student attempts to use strategies to solve problem. Those strategies may not be appropriate for the problem. These 3 students struggled in a particular way. So 3 of my 20 students struggled with representing with problem solving by not being able to show good problem solving strategies or something like that. So this is a pattern of learning. What was up with these 3 students? All right? And you could imagine for these 7 students here, what was going on with these 7 students in regards to conceptual understanding that kept them from being proficient. And those would be patterns of learning that you could describe in your commentary. So this is one way to look at the charter table. Let's look at a different charter table that might help as well. And this particular charter table is set out with students' names. Now, this particular charter table follows from that rubric. So the rubric I just set out for you, there were 4 levels from emerging to exemplary, and these numbers correspond to those different levels. Okay? So a 4 would be a high mark. 4 would be exemplary, 3 would be proficient, 2 would be developing, and 1 would be emerging. And from that table, you can see that some students are struggling. So here's Connor, who is emerging in every one of the areas we care about. And so in terms of procedures, concepts, and problem solving, the ones that matter for edTPA, this student has great struggles. If we look across, you might see other students like Harold. Harold is doing well, so proficient, exemplary, proficient, and lower on communication. Now, what's nice about this is that looking across this table, we can see how students are doing, but we also can be looking at columns, down the columns, and we can look to see that of the understandings or the criteria set out, the communication is the lowest, and we could see that conceptual understanding is the strongest. We can also look for bunches or pairs or bundles of numbers to see, what was it with 3 or 4 students? What was it with these 3 students where they were proficient? All right? So a table or chart like this, or the one that I just shared with you before, sets you up to look for patterns of learning. So do set yourself up with a good table or chart that gives you good information. And of course, that table or chart only works as well as or as good as the evaluation criteria that you've set out. Are you clear about what these are? The other thing to note in this particular chart is that this person has noted who the 3 focus students are. We'll talk about focus students in a moment. Might as well start. 3 focus students have some particular area of struggle that should be addressed in the re-engagement lesson. So these 3 students will be a part of the re-engagement lesson, and it could be around concepts. They all were very low in some conceptual understanding of this topic. All right, so the significant part of that is that your re-engagement lesson is based on analysis that comes from a chart like this or from your narrative. Based on your analysis, or based on my analysis, I see that Connor, Mona, and Penny are struggling with this particular conceptual piece of the mathematics we studied. All right? So everything falls from your analysis of these charts. So let's go on. The next piece is that you want to select and submit 3 work samples that demonstrate an area of struggle, as we just talked about Connor, Mona, and Penny. So that area of struggle came from your analysis, and you want to analyze errors and misconceptions related to that struggle. And you'll be writing this up in the commentary, and I'll get into more detail in that in a little bit. All right? So that's analyzing student work. This is a significant, important part of task 4. All right? Everything that you do following that The re-engaging students to learn mathematics has to come from your good analysis. All right? So let's think about re-engaging students in learning mathematics. You want to identify a targeted learning objective or goal, and the important part here is based on the analysis of student work, just as we did a moment ago. Following that targeted learning objective, where did they struggle? What was the thing that was hanging them up? You want to design a re-engagement lesson. Okay, and it needs to be based on that targeted learning goal. Following that, you will be teaching the re-engagement lesson. All right, and that lesson needs to have the 3 focus students in that lesson, but it doesn't mean that they're in a group of their own. In fact, you should have more students in that group, but the 3 students must be included in that group. Next, you want to collect and submit the 3 focus students' work samples from the re-engagement lesson, and you want to use what work they did from that re-engagement lesson to talk about, to describe their understandings, okay? To provide new evidence of students' mathematical understanding. And then there's a description of how you might submit this work. If you add audio or video for that work, remember, for each focus student, video or audio work sample must be no more than 5 minutes in total running time. And then, importantly, this is one of the essential things for this task, you want to evaluate the effectiveness of that re-engagement lesson and consider its impact on student learning. So let's go over some important things from this particular page. And I'm going to circle back as I've done before. You do need to keep in mind the 3 as you build your assessment. So as you develop and adapt a formative assessment, keep in mind conceptual understanding, computational procedural fluency, mathematical reasoning, and problem-solving skills. Always these 3. When you develop your evaluation criteria, guess what? That's the same thing. Develop your evaluation criteria that will help you to analyze student learning. Make sure that your evaluation criteria address these 3 again in some form. Now when we get to designing your re-engagement lesson, you want to start with the idea, you might even use the phrase, based on my analysis, okay? Based on your analysis from the chart or graph or narrative, you are looking for patterns of learning, okay? And from the patterns of learning that you've seen, you want to identify or set out a targeted learning objective. The targeted learning objective should come from patterns of learning you have identified in your analysis of the student's results. So keep that in mind. Everything should hold together. And then lastly on this page, your analysis should focus on change. This is going to be an important word. Your analysis should focus on change in students' understanding of the mathematics. You'll need evidence to show this change, right? So when you're evaluating the effectiveness of your re-engagement lesson, think about, how are my students different? What was the change in their mathematical understanding, and how do I support it with evidence? All right. Now there's some features that you need to pay attention to in this. So you're collecting lots of different kinds of evidence. So the suggestion from edTPA is you look at this section, and there'll be a link in your electronic document. See the Mathematics Assessment Task for Artifacts and Commentary Specifications to make sure you have everything in order. Okay. And then next, and this falls for all the tasks you do, if you're having trouble with audio within an audio clip or a video clip, find a way to support it. Okay, you can add a transcription, you can embed quotes, or you can insert captions in the video. Remember, the big idea is to make it so that the reader of your assessment doesn't have to work too hard to know what's going on. You want the reader to be focused on your teaching and your students' learning, not on whether the evidence makes sense or can be heard or not. Okay? Let's get to the next section. What do I need to write? So, in Mathematics Assessment Task 4, you will write these 4 things as 4 pieces. A description of your context for learning. So this is the mathematics context for learning, in which you'll share the program and the materials as well as who your students are. A learning segment overview, because you haven't set out lesson plans for this particular task. You need to say what was going on within those lessons. A re-engagement lesson plan. Okay, and we'll talk in detail about that in a moment. And then the commentary that fits with all the things that have been mentioned already for this particular task. So let's go ahead and go to the commentary. And remember, commentary is one of the places where you give evidence of your own good teaching and student learning. So you want to address every prompt completely in full and address all parts of every prompt. And the other piece, throughout all the assessment tasks or all the tasks that you do, give lots of good evidence. Okay? So let's start with this. This commentary should not be more than 8 pages. Okay? But you may include these additional things, the assessment itself, and if necessary, transcription of inaudible portions of a video audio clip or of a work sample can be included, and no more than 2 additional pages. So here are your page limitations. So let's get started on what you're actually writing. So, analyzing student learning whole class. And I want to note something here so you can keep yourself in order here. There's A and B here under analyzing student learning, but there's also a C on the next page. So you might flip ahead so you see all 3 parts of those. So let's get started on this, analyzing student learning whole class. Identify the specific learning objectives measured by the formative assessment you chose for your analysis. Okay, so set those out. You might support those, and I've seen them supported with content standards, but the learning objectives should be students are intended, the learning segment intended to teach these things to the students in terms of mathematics. The next piece, which we've shared already, provide a graphic, chart, or table or narrative that summarizes student learning for the whole class. Be sure to summarize student learning for all evaluation criteria submitted in Mathematics Assessment Task 4 Part D. So this is loaded. Let's take this apart. You have a choice between sharing a graphic, table, or chart. So a chart or table kind of graphic. So that's one choice. Or you can write a narrative. All right? So you make a choice between those. But you want that narrative or that graphic to summarize student learning for the whole class. Okay, so you need to give whole class results. And that summary for student learning should capture or display your evaluation criteria. So your evaluation criteria should be evident in that chart, table, or narrative. Okay? So let's think about the big ideas from this page. First off, on the what do I need to write piece, there are 4 pieces. Let's go through the 4 pieces. The first piece is the mathematics context for learning. The second being an overview of the lessons that were taught that set up the assessment. You need to write a lesson plan for the re-engagement lesson. And then you need to write a commentary for the whole task, which covers all of these other things as well, especially your analysis and then your re-engagement lesson and teaching. Okay. One other thing. Remember this complicated prompt here. You want to set out your learning objectives. Okay, so that's A here. What were your learning objectives? And you want to represent student learning through a chart or narrative based on the evaluation criteria. This is the second piece. Now the one that's on the next page is going to be asking you to write about patterns of learning. All right, for the important 3. And the important 3 are conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and mathematical reasoning and problem solving. All right, so let's get to that one that's left over on the next page. So C on this page. So using examples from the summary chart, discuss the patterns of learning across the whole class, okay? Relative to, and of course, all three, our three friends for the math task. And as I've shared with you already, patterns of learning, make sure we can see this properly. So the patterns of learning, being a little finicky here. All right, so patterns of learning, we can see that the patterns of learning include both quantitative and qualitative patterns or consistencies for different groups or individuals. Patterns indicate in a numerical way the information understood from the assessment. Examples given, 10 out of 15 students or 20% of the students. Okay, so my suggestion for in your write-up for this particular prompt is that you use that kind of phrasing. Okay, so 3 out of my 15 students or 8 out of my 15 students showed this form of conceptual understanding or this misunderstanding. 5 out of my 15 students did well in procedural fluency, but 6 of my 15 students struggled with this particular piece of the procedure. So think about everything in terms of patterns of learning. Okay? Next, oops, let's not do that. I'll get this straight. Okay. The next thing we care about, yeah, just give me a moment, please. I'm almost there. Okay. So let's look at number 2 now. Let's put our patterns of learning aside. Patterns of learning have been very difficult for me this morning, but hopefully they won't be for you. So goodbye, patterns of learning. Let's look at number 2 here. Number 2, analyzing student learning. We want to think about the 3 focus students. Okay, so essential here, from your analysis of the whole class student learning, okay, so you choose your 3 students based on your analysis set out in that chart or that narrative that you've done for a different prompt, okay? So you want to identify one area where students struggled mathematically. That will become your focus for everything that follows, all right? So you're starting from your analysis of your teaching, from the students' work on the assessment. Then you choose an area where students struggled, and you choose 3 students to represent that struggle. Now, that struggle could be across many students, but you want 3 students to be focused on in your work to follow, all right? And the suggestion is at least one of the students should have a specific learning need. And here's some examples here. Okay, and when you write up this part later on, when you talk about your 3 students, you should say what that particular learning need was. Okay, so let's continue. Part A, the first prompt, is probably the easiest prompt for the commentary in the mathematics assessment task. What form did you submit work samples for the 3 students? If they're turning in a paper form, then you write about it. You say it's a text file. If you have an audio file or a video file of their work, then you'll say that's what I'm working from. Okay? Let's go to the analysis part now, B. You want to analyze the 3 students' work samples, and you want to describe the students' struggles. Okay? So you think about it, struggles, needs, struggles. What was it they are working through and haven't quite gotten yet? Okay? Based on your analysis of their assessment from the beginning of this task, what is it they're still struggling with? All right? Now, particularly important here is you need to cite evidence from the work samples about that struggle. So you want to actually write up the problems that they struggle with and then describe what was going on in those problems that sets out their struggle. Okay? And then you can see here, what do the students' errors tell you about their mathematical understanding? And you can read this example for yourself. All right? Now, a practical one is C here. If a video or audio work sample occurs in a group context, make sure you identify for the score for the reader of this assessment who's who. All right? Now, after you've done this analysis, okay, so you've done your analysis of your 3 focus students here, you need to set out a lesson. And the lesson needs to be organized in a particular way. The first thing that you will need to do is set out a targeted learning objective or goal. Okay, and I would suggest using that phrase or that term in your write-up. My targeted learning objective is, and you can imagine what would follow. The other part of this that matters is you want to base your analysis. You want this targeted learning objective to be based on your analysis of your students' work samples. So a way to think about this would be, based on my analysis of my students' work, my targeted learning goal objective based on their struggle will be, okay, you can see how all of that fits with this first prompt. All right? You're not setting out a lesson about anything. Your lesson has to follow from a particular struggle or need. Okay? Now, B has 5 parts, and they're broken across 2 pages. But you want to make sure that you would hit all 5 parts in your lesson plan. So B is the lesson planning. So we take a look here. Okay, describe the re-engagement lesson you designed to develop each focus student's mathematical knowledge in relation to the targeted learning objective or goal. Okay, so lesson plan follows from your targeted learning objective or goal. And here are the things that need to be included. The first 3, and there are 2 more on the next page, the first 3, you need to restate your targeted learning objective or goal somewhere in your description of your lesson plan. Next, you need to set out the state-adopted content standards that fit with this objective or goal. The third bullet point is the part you're probably most familiar with. This is actually what you're doing. So what strategies and learning tasks are going to be happening in this lesson. Now the essential piece right here is you need to include in this lesson plan portion, include in your strategies and learning tasks what you are doing and what the students will be doing. This shouldn't just be about you, what you're doing. I will do this, then I will do this, I will follow with this. You need to be including students' involvement as well, and you want students to be actively engaged. Right? So they're doing something with the mathematics rather than just completing a worksheet. What are they doing in that task? So if they're working with materials, what are they doing mathematically with those materials? Keep all those good lesson planning ideas and keep the mathematical focus in your planning. All right? So I'm going to go over the key points from this page. All right. So going back up to 2. Analyzing student learning, the 3 focus students. Remember, you want to focus on ones that have shared a particular struggle based on your analysis. Some shared struggle a group of students showed in the assessment. So your 3 focus students shared something in common, a particular struggle. Next, as you write up your analysis of each of the 3 focus students, you want to write about the specific problems that show their errors, misunderstandings, and describe the underlying mathematical confusion. Okay? So for each one of those students, so you're analyzing the 3 students' work samples, and you're describing their struggles. And as I've said already, I'll say it again because it's very important. Those struggles need to be supported. Your definition of those struggles needs to be supported with evidence from their work samples, from the actual problems, as you can see in problem 2A and then you describe the problem the student struggled with. All right, so particular evidence from the work samples. So that's very important. And lastly, from this page, there are going to be 5 parts to your lesson plan. We have have 3 of those 5 parts down here. You need to have the targeted learning objective. You need to have the content standards. You need to have the strategies and learning tasks that would follow. And on the next page, we'll talk about the next 2, representations, resources, materials, and the last part being the assessment for the re-engagement lesson. So let's take a look at that. Okay. So the last 2 parts of the re-engagement lesson, you want to describe the representations and other instructional resources and materials that you're using. So this could be, whatever manipulatives you're using, or whatever kind of worksheet you're using, or any other kinds of tools like whiteboards or chart paper, those kinds of things that students might use to represent their learning. So keep that in mind. And the last piece of this is the assessments that you're going to be using during your re-engagement lesson. Now there's a key piece here. It's not an assessment that's just at the end of your re-engagement lesson. It says for monitoring student learning during the lesson. So what you want to do in your lesson planning is set out certain points where you're checking for understanding. And this may be a question that's put out there. It could be some kind of gauge for understanding, thumbs up, thumbs down. It could be some kind of short response, quiz or something in the middle, something simple. And you can see the examples they set out here. So this is monitoring student learning during the lesson, not just this at the end of the lesson, but during the lesson. You're asking the kids to pair share, and you're listening in on what they say to one another, or you're having them report back what their partners said. The kids might use whiteboards and show you what they're thinking and turn them around, and you can see all the kids' whiteboards at once, or you could be walking around the room looking at what they're doing on their whiteboards, a quick quiz along the way. So this is really, really important, because you're going to need this for your write-up on the effectiveness of the lesson. So let's go over this part real quick before we go on. 5 parts to the lesson plan. Again, you want to have a targeted learning objective. You want to set out the content standards. You want to set out the strategies and learning tasks you'll be using. And from this page, the representations, resources, materials that will be involved. And then finally, the assessment to monitor student learning during the lesson. Okay? To monitor student learning during the lesson. What are the multiple ways that you'll be checking for understanding along the way? Next, you have to do this next part before you write up the next section of the commentary. You actually can't do it without doing this first. So you need to actually reteach the lesson. So before responding to prompt 4, you want to reteach the re-engagement lesson. And this lesson may be taught with the 3 focus students one-on-one, in small group, or with the whole class. All right? So just make sure that you're doing all of these good things along the way. But here's something to anticipate before you teach your engagement lesson. Your engagement lesson is about changing the students' mathematical understandings in the area that they struggled in. So you want to be thinking about that as you're teaching. As you're teaching your students, how is this lesson? Ask yourself, how is your teaching? How is this lesson? How are the students engaged in a way that's changing their understanding in that area of struggle? That's the most important part of the re-engagement lesson. The re-engagement lesson is meant to change understanding in relation to the area of struggle. So let's go ahead and go down to the analyzing teaching section now. All right, so you've taught the lesson, and then the evidence you've collected from the 3 students' work samples, so whatever work you've had them do in the re-engagement lesson, you're going to respond to these prompts. All right, so the first one is a simple question again. In what form did you submit the 3 students' work samples for re-engagement lesson? And you have choices: work samples, audio files, or video files. Now you could imagine, and this might be a smart way to think about it, If you're doing some kind of ongoing assessment or monitoring student learning throughout the lesson, then a video would be very supportive of that kind of, would allow you to collect evidence of that very readily. You would have more than one artifact. You could write about what particular students are doing at different points in time within the video. All right, so need to keep these in mind, all right, because you're looking for change in students' understanding. B, you want to analyze the effectiveness of the strategies you used during the re-engagement lesson to develop mathematical understanding in the identified area of struggle. Okay, so based on what you see in the video or in students' work, what's changed for your students, all right? And it's best described here. Consider the change in students' mathematical understanding or misconceptions in relation to the identified area of struggle when describing the effectiveness of the re-engagement lesson, all right? So your analysis has to be about changes in thinking, changes in mathematical thinking for your 3 focus students, all right? And then C, and this goes for all video. If you're focusing, if you want to describe what any particular student's doing and it's not clear which student is which, you need to give some identifying mark to say this particular student was wearing the red sweatshirt or something like that. All right, so some points for this particular page. First off, we've talked about the 5 points to the lesson. Okay, make sure you've hit all 5 of these points. And don't do it just because it's an edTPA requirement. If you do these 5 well, then your re-engagement lesson, your actual teaching, will be more successful. So really, really give good time for this so that you will have a good lesson to teach your students. Okay? And the important part down here, when you're thinking about the effectiveness of the lesson, describe the effectiveness of your engagement lesson in terms of change in students' mathematical understanding. Okay? So it's how they think differently now because you've taught them that matters in your re-engagement lesson. That's what an effective lesson should do. And then, of course, whatever change that is that you're describing should be focused on that area of struggle that you identified earlier on in your analysis. All right? So let's go on to the rubrics for this task. There are just 3 for the mathematics task. And the first rubric for the mathematics assessment task is analyzing whole class understandings. All right? And you can see with level 3, this is a passing level. The candidate identifies what the candidate identifies what students did right and wrong related to conceptual understanding and, then you get a choice, procedural fluency or mathematical reasoning or problem solving. So you really have to do 2 of these, but you must do conceptual understanding for a 3. Okay, so it's a base requirement, but you really should be shooting for a 4 because that will encourage you to do really good mathematics teaching. So let's see what 4 says. Under level 4, the candidate identifies and explicitly connects patterns of learning. So you can see the change already. The candidate identifies what students did right and wrong versus a focus on patterns of learning. Okay, so this is looking across class in ways and across the mathematics instead of just a binary 2-dimensional right and wrong focus. Now you can see that the next part is similar. You have to have a focus on conceptual understanding, but you want to be able to talk about procedural fluency or mathematical reasoning and problem solving. Okay, so the difference between a 3 and 4 is essentially a difference between right and wrong and patterns of learning. So you have a focus on patterns of learning, you'll move to a 4. So keep that in mind. The next rubric for this one, analyzing individual student work samples. So these are your 3 focus students. How does the candidate use student work to analyze mathematical errors, confusions, and partial understandings? For 3, which is passing, the candidate uses evidence from the 3 focus student work samples to identify the specific student struggles. Okay, so you looked at your students' work and you found where they're struggling. That's a 3. A 4, and we want to take our work to the 4. In a 4, the candidate uses evidence from the 3 focus student work samples, so far the same, and here's the difference, to explain the student's struggles. Okay? And the other addition here is in relation to the related mathematical concepts. So the difference between a 3 and a 4 here is that in a 3 you're just identifying struggles. In a 4 you're explaining the struggles in relation to the related mathematical concepts. So giving detail about the struggles, explaining what's going on with students' work, will move you from a 3 to a 4. And of course, this is the key word for this particular rubric, explain. The last rubric, 18, using evidence to reflect on teaching. How does the candidate examine the re-engagement lesson to further student learning? For 3, which is passing, candidate uses evidence of student learning from the 3 student work samples to describe whether or not the re-engagement lesson was effective. Okay, so using evidence to say whether it was effective or not. Let's see what 4 asks for. And we do want to shoot for 4s. There's a key word in this one that's different than the other. So if we look here, candidate uses evidence of student learning, candidate uses specific evidence. Okay, so that means you're looking at particular things the students are doing that are related to the focused mathematical content, the targeted learning objectives. So the candidate uses specific evidence of student learning from the 3 student work samples, okay, to evaluate whether or not the re-engagement strategy was effective. So a difference here is for 3, to describe whether or not the re-engagement strategy was effective, and a 4 is to evaluate whether or not the re-engagement strategy was effective. Okay, to evaluate would mean that you have some kind of criteria, some kinds of things you were hoping that should happen in that lesson. So if you're going to evaluate the effectiveness of your re-engagement lesson, base your evaluation on the criteria you set out in your targeted learning objectives. If you look at your targeted learning objectives for that re-engagement lesson and students show good evidence that they meet those things, meet those objectives, or they might still struggle in regards to those objectives, then you're evaluating the effectiveness of the lesson, not just saying students seem to be pleased with their work and they have good answers. You want to evaluate your work in your re-engagement lesson relative to the criteria you set out in your lesson planning. All right? So the big idea here is evaluate rather than simply describe, and that will move you to a 4. All right. Task 4 is a long task, and there's lots to set up beforehand. Essential things to keep in mind. You want to choose a learning segment that is rich in mathematical opportunity for kids to show their conceptual understanding, procedural fluency, and problem solving and reasoning. As you can see in this task, conceptual understanding is one of the foci of the work that you need to be doing in mathematics. So make sure that your initial lessons allow kids to show you their conceptual understanding through pictures, diagrams, writing, however you might set them up to do that, because the more they do that, the more material you have to analyze and make sense of what they understand. We went through what it means to make a chart or table to represent students' work and how you might analyze that work in regards to the 3 that we care about in this task. I've talked about the 3 focus students and the need to focus on an area of struggle, and then to build a re-engagement lesson around that area of struggle that includes particular parts that set you up for that, to do well by that lesson. And I've gone through the rubrics for this task, the 3 rubrics for this task. And if you pay attention closely to the differences between 3 and 4, you should be able to move yourself to 4s and do well. As I've said before in the other tasks, set yourself up to work towards a 4 for your own sake, for your own good teaching, not just to get a good mark on edTPA. If you're working towards 4s across the edTPA assessments, then you're building and improving on your teaching, which is what should be hoped for. I do hope this has been helpful to you.